Welcome to Western Civ. In this supplemental interview, I sit down with historian Edward Shawcross and discuss his upcoming book, The Last Emperor of Mexico. I have to say, it's a story I didn't know anything about, but I found endlessly fascinating. It's a superb book, and I recommend in October picking it up when it comes out. It's an amazing story about how Napoleon III and the French Empire tried to put an emperor on the throne of Mexico while the United States was occupied by the American Civil War. It features personalities like Napoleon III, Maximilian, Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so many more. It's a minute-by-minute account. I couldn't recommend the book enough. Here, Shawcross and I hit a couple of the main points, gives you a good sense of the story, and something that you might want to look out for in the future. If you'd like more in an audio version, but you don't want the full thing yet, that's okay. I did a truncated version of the story, maybe 2.5 hours worth. That's available to patrons online at patreon.com/Western Civ podcast. Check it out. And now, the interview. And I'm sitting down here with Edward Shawcross. We're talking about his book, The Last Emperor of Mexico, which I loved, was fascinated by, especially because I feel like I should have known this story, and I don't, for whatever reason. Before we jump into some of the specific questions, I thought, why don't we do a brief overview here? What is this scheme, this plan to put an Austrian Archduke on the throne of Mexico? It's got some great characters, everyone from Napoleon III, everyone's favorite Napoleon, down to Maximilian himself and his wife Carlotta. So can you just kind of give me a quick overview of who comes up with this plan, and who are the major people that come into play?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. You're right. It's not a very well-known story, but it's certainly an outlandish one with epic scale. In terms of it really is a conspiracy, and who comes up with that conspiracy to create an empire in Mexico? There's a Mexican dimension, as you'd expect. There's a group of Mexican politicians who have, in many ways, always dreamed of what they would call restoring Mexico to a monarchy, right? Because when Mexico becomes independent, it actually becomes independent as an empire, unlike most Latin American states. And it has an emperor. It quickly becomes a republic. That first emperor's disaster. But there's a very small but powerful elite in Mexico who feel that was always the wrong turn. And so they've had this kind of dream for a long time. They need to find someone, for want of a better word, crazy enough to listen to that dream. And that is exactly the man that you introduced there, Napoleon III. So he's emperor of the French, and a man who likes gambles and conspiracies. So they really have found their ideal candidate to try and get this scheme going. And he is the man who puts, the power of the French state behind this regime change. In terms of principal characters, so you've got the Mexican conspiracists, you've got Napoleon III. You also have to have Benito Juarez, who is the constitutional president of Mexico, who Napoleon III decides to overthrow and replace with a monarchy. And then, of course, the final character, in a way, you think he should be front and center, but he's Maximilian himself, because, of course, for a monarchy, you need a monarch. And Maximilian is that man because he's very ambitious. He believes he's born to rule. But unfortunately for him, he's born second, as it were, because his elder brother, Franz Josef, is the Emperor of Austria. Maximilian's unlikely to inherit that crown, but he sees himself as someone who should have an empire. So when Napoleon III and the Mexicans who are involved in the conspiracy are looking around Europe for a monarch, they've got this ideal candidate in Maximilian.
And we'll get to this question later on. You're right. Maximilian maybe not likely to inherit from Franz Josef, but not impossible, as it would turn out at one point. And what about his wife? I really enjoyed Carlotta and the roles that she played in the conspiracy to come. She's a very interesting character, is she not?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and very remiss of me not to introduce her there right at the beginning. She's an extraordinary woman. She also believes that she's born to rule. So just to give a little biography of her, she's actually the daughter of the Belgian king Leopold I, and of course Belgium is a relatively new country. It becomes independent in 1831, so about 30 years before the events that the book's looking at. But she's actually the granddaughter of a former French king, and that side of her family, of course, goes back centuries as well. So she herself thinks, although she loves Belgium, she loves her father. She has that kind of sort of old dynastic heritage as well. Now she's an incredibly determined woman, and in many ways, she's kind of the driving force of Maximilian's decision to go to Mexico, because she is incredibly ambitious, and as a woman in the 19th century, to have a meaningful political role, she needs to make a suitable match. That match is Maximilian. They marry very, very young from her point of view. She's only 17 when they get married. She's kind of swept off her feet because Maximilian is a little bit older. He's 25 when they get married, and he's traveled a lot in the Mediterranean, and he's a well-known aristocrat. And so Carlotta sort of take one look at him and thinks, yeah, that's my way out of Belgium, as it were. And she is absolutely determined to rule really as a co-equal. Critics of Maximilian would say that he doesn't make any decision without first consulting his wife, and real critics would say he doesn't make any decision. She makes the decisions. So she's his driving force. She's ambitious. She's young. She's clever. She's intelligent, and she very much wants once this opportunity presents itself to them as a couple. She is the one, even more so than Maximilian, saying absolutely, this is our destiny.
Yeah, I found the aspects of their relationship fascinating throughout the book because there's, in history, sometimes we get bogged down with the big names on the cover, but these are personalities who have personal relationships too, and their personal relationship was one of the driving forces behind everything that comes into be, whether you want to describe it as a historical event or a tragedy. I think you can go either way with it personally. But there's really two external things that kind of happen here to get the ball rolling on the conspiracy. The first is, Benito Juarez and the Mexican government owe a tremendous amount of money to various European banking interests and decide they're not going to pay it back at some point. And the other, and this is the one that I find interesting as an American, because what you have going on simultaneously to the north is the American Civil War, which starts in April of 1861. And so I understand why, in the context of that, maybe why this story doesn't get as much play in American audiences, because you have the epic struggle between the Union and the Confederacy going on a couple hundred miles to the north, a couple of miles depending upon where you are in Texas. And I thought it was interesting that if that American Civil War doesn't break out when it does, maybe these events don't happen. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because you do in the book.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The American Civil War, that context is crucial. Without the American Civil War, there's no Mexican Empire. It's that simple. And Napoleon III is very clear about that. So these Mexican emigres and exiles, Mexico's been in a state of near chaos really ever since you could argue in independence. There's huge amount of political instability, but in the 1850s especially. So you've just come out of the U.S.-Mexican War, where Mexico loses nearly half of its national territory. And the decade that follows is riven by conflict between various different political factions. And during many of those of the kind of leaders of the conservative group, there's a conservative party in Mexico, and they believe they should be orientated more to Europe. They have, that Mexico should be based in Catholicism and would tend towards a more authoritarian form of government. Now, these politicians have been desperate for European aid in their struggles against the likes of Benito Juarez, who you mentioned there. And they've several times asked directly to European governments, including France and Napoleon III, we're Catholic, we support order, the United States of America, it wants a continuous expansion. It would be in your interest to support us. And Napoleon III, each time he's asked, either, often in secret back channels, other times in open diplomatic representations from members of the Mexican government, I say that, there's absolutely, I'd love to help. I can't because of the United States of America. The United States of America, with your listeners probably be aware of the Monroe Doctrine formulated in 1823. And it's at heart, it says there shall be no European intervention in the Americas. It's designed to safeguard the independence of the Latin American states after their wars of independence and their breakaway from the Spanish Empire. Now, most statesmen in Europe see it as if not quite a joke, something to sneer at contemptuously, right? This young upstart republic sort of dictating policy to Europe. But although they don't take it especially seriously, they don't challenge it, right? They take it seriously enough not to challenge it. There are European interventions in Latin America in this period, but nothing on the scale that you're going to see in the 1860s. With the U.S. Civil War creates that geopolitical space for Napoleon III to carve out the Mexican Empire, and without it, he wouldn't have sent 30,000 troops to Mexico. What you would have seen is, the diplomatic protests from Washington before he even got to that stage would have absolutely been enough to prevent Napoleon III, who's got no desire to be fighting a war against the United States of America across the Atlantic, right? So it's the U.S. Civil War. It's the opportunity that he's been waiting for to get involved in the Americas without any opposition from the United States.
Yeah, and that kind of gets me to the first French intervention. And originally the British think that they're going to get these debts repaid, but they're not going to intervene in the domestic policy of Mexico. They end up dropping out very quickly. It ends up being primarily a French intervention. I sometimes wonder, I can't imagine a leader of a modern nation state like Napoleon III being so naive. Maybe he was. I don't know. But to wonder, what the Mexican people were going to think when thousands of French troops show up in the port city of Veracruz. But they do. And why don't you walk us through what sort of the initial reaction of the people in Mexico is to all those French troops there?
Yeah, no, it is complicated because, as you say, the Mexican government owes money to these European powers, and it suspends them. The government's bankrupt; they can't make those payments. Now, in the mid-19th century, if you stop paying your debts to European governments, you're going to get the navy pretty quickly on your door, and that's exactly what happens with what's called a tripartite intervention: Britain and Spain and France. Now, it's complicated because Britain and Spain are just going there. It's a debt collection exercise that's fairly routine, and it has happened in other Latin American states around that time. Napoleon III has, in league with these Mexican monarchists, is going to create, so he hopes, an empire. Now, of course, these emigres, they are a defeated faction in a civil war that's torn Mexico apart from 1858 to 1861. So when they go to Napoleon III, they say, look, we've got a huge amount of support. Benito Juarez, he talks about liberty and constitutions. He's a despot. He's attacking religion. Mexico's a very Catholic country. So if you turn up with your troops defending Catholicism, you're going to be given the welcome of a liberator. So they overpromise because that's entirely not true. There is some opposition to Juarez, and they have just fought a 3-year civil war. So in that sense, there are still bands of thousands, low thousands. This is not talking many, low thousands of armed troops who have not yet surrendered to Juarez and are willing to continue the civil war and will work with anyone, including a foreign invader, in the attempt of overturning that defeat. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the vast majority of the Mexican nation has absolutely no desire to continue a civil war that they thought had finished in January 1861, and it looks like the French are just going to reignite that. Secondly, as you say, it's a foreign invading force, right? This is never a strong look in any part of history, and you can see this in numerous interventions right into the 21st century. Whatever the intentions of that intervening power, you're going to get a strong nationalist reaction. The majority of people in Mexico rally behind the government of Juarez and are absolutely determined to fight whatever it is that the French have come to do. And the other thing to stress, part of the reason why you're not going to get much popular support is this. This is a conspiracy. Most people in Mexico have no idea. Not just in Mexico, Britain and France, right? Britain and Spain, rather, France's allies have no idea really that Napoleon III is going to suddenly break away from this debt collecting exercise and try and found a monarchy. I mean, there are rumors, but most people are like, well, that's an absolutely crazy idea to try and do that. So there's not really any way that they can lay the ground, except insofar as there are some people who are so desperate to continue to struggle against Juarez that they will side with the French and try and found this monarchy with them. But the majority of people, rally to the nationalist cause, get behind Juarez, and determined to resist the French intervention in whatever shape it takes.
Well, and you can understand why Britain and Spain would think that it's a crazy idea to put a monarch on the throne of Mexico. Mexico is an enormous country. And I love it in the book when you pointed out when the French army gets there it doesn't have 30,000 men to begin with. It builds up, but they don't even have any military maps. They have to borrow maps from Napoleon III's personal library. They don't even know where they're going to a large extent. So the first few thousand troops show up. They get beaten, by the way, for my listeners, if you're interested. Well, how they get beaten ends up being the story of Cinco de Mayo. No, it has nothing to do with the Mexican War of Independence. Want to know more about it? Buy the book. It's a good description of it. So you'll be able to tell your friends when Cinco de Mayo rolls around where it actually comes from. But who isn't at the head of that first French invasion is Maximilian. He doesn't go right away. He kind of waits for the French forces to, plow the road, as it were, to get things ready for him, to win his empire for him so that he can come in, with all the bells and whistles and take possession of it. And so a huge chunk of the beginning of the book, it takes place before he even gets to Mexico, because he expects things, I think, to be done for him by the time he gets there. And before he gets there, I think one of the most fascinating parts of the book to me, and I want to get into it now, is right before he goes to accept the Mexican crown, a problem crops up. A problem that I really feel like Franz Josef should have seen coming from a ways ahead. He doesn't. The problem involves Maximilian's Austrian inheritance. Can you walk us through the problem that comes up and how they solve it?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That's an extraordinary story, and so the French intervention, the troops land in January of 1862. Maximilian does not arrive in Mexico until May 1864, 2.5 years after the intervention begins. And in a way, that's a kind of insight into Maximilian's character. He's a man who doesn't take decisions decisively. Let's just say that for now. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about his personality later. And so, he's waiting to see what happens, and Cinco de Mayo is really important because, of course, had the French been victorious at that battle and marched onto Mexico City, then maybe things get going a little bit earlier. And it shows what we were talking about earlier as well, that there's not a huge amount of support. So Maximilian's in Europe, he's receiving all of this news, but, cut a long story short, eventually, the French army send reinforcements, they take Mexico City, and they proclaim this empire because of the sheer weight of military power that they take over across the Atlantic. Now, there's a problem that Franz Josef has. He's as the elder brother, head of the House of Hapsburg. Anything that Maximilian does, be it marriage, be it career, be it certainly accepting the crown of another nation state, he has to sign off on. But Maximilian is, at the time that he accepts it, this is in 1864, he's still third in line to the throne. Franz Josef, the emperor, he's got a young son, Crown Prince Rudolf, who goes to sort of infamy and notorious later on because he ends his life with a suicide pact with his 17-year-old mistress, but that's way, way off in the future. So Maximilian's third in line to the throne. In those days, obviously, the kind of mortality rate for children is not fantastic. So it doesn't take much for Maximilian to become Emperor of Austria. And then you're in this extraordinary scenario for the Habsburg monarchy, right, which stretches all the way back to the 13th century. Suddenly you're being ruled by someone in Mexico, right? This Austrian kingdom. So Franz Josef said, well, wait a second. Look, if you're going to become Emperor of Mexico, you have to sign this document that says you renounce all of your rights to inheritance in the Habsburg lands. You have to give up your titles. You have to give it up not just for yourself, but all of your descendants. Otherwise, I'm not going to give you permission to go. Now, Maximilian is absolutely furious about this because his entire identity is just wrapped up in sort of Habsburg lineage. I mean, this is what he grows up studying at school, and he loves it. He's got pictures of all of his famous and illustrious ancestors in his home. He knows the history off by heart, and he's just mesmerized by that. So taking that away from him is a huge part of his identity, which he doesn't want to do. And you're absolutely right. Why doesn't Franz Josef foresee this? Well, the simple answer is Franz Josef's character. This is an incredibly sort of rigid and conservative and individual who hates confrontation. And so he keeps putting it off, essentially. He puts it off for a long time, right? Because we've got 2.5 years to solve this. It's first brought to Maximilian's attention in January 1864, when the Austrian foreign minister says, by the way, if you accept the crown, you're going to have to renounce your rights, which Maximilian essentially laughs off and says, don't be ridiculous. I mean, I think that would have been mentioned to me beforehand. And then Franz Josef then does the classic thing, which is, so Maximilian's going off to France to meet with Napoleon III, sign documents, sign up to a loan, which money has already been raised for, a military alliance, and put his signature all of these things. Just as he's leaving for Paris, Franz Josef hands him a document and says, oh, by the way, you want to have a quick read of this and sign it for me and then just give it to me when you come back in 2 weeks' time? This is the document that says, you will not inherit the crown, your descendants will not inherit the crown, and you need to give up all of your financial benefits that you get as being part of the Habsburg monarchy from the civil list, right? So Maximilian, he goes, apoplectic. He goes to Paris, signs all of the treaties, subscribes to the loan, etc. Does the kind of PR for his new empire, and comes back and just tells Franz Josef, "I'm not signing that document. There's no way I'm renouncing my rights." To which Franz Josef then responds, "Well, you're not going to Mexico." So you've got this extraordinary situation where Maximilian's agreed to become Emperor of Mexico. He's signed a military alliance with France. Napoleon III has spent hundreds of millions of francs and sent thousands of men, many of whom have obviously died fighting to carve out this kingdom. And suddenly the news reaches Paris that Maximilian is no longer willing to go because, as far as Napoleon III can see, he's had an argument with his brother. So this is the kind of personal politics that becomes really serious. The way it's solved is the way actually a lot of these impasses are solved for Maximilian, he goes in very rigid conditions and says, there's no way I'm going to sign it, and is slowly whistled away, not least by Carlotta, his wife, who is by this point absolutely determined to become empress and essentially forces him into a compromise. He says to Franz Josef, okay, look, we can come to a deal. So first of all, I'd like to keep my money, right? So if I go to Mexico, I give up the succession, but I keep all of the palaces and the money from the royal list. Franz Josef said, fine. A second, slightly more telling condition is that he tries to insert a clause into the contract where he renounces his right and says, if things don't work out in Mexico and I come back to Austria, then I should be allowed to be put back into exactly the position I was, i.e., third in line to the throne, and my descendants, depending on what happens, will also be, in line for the Habsburg throne. And Franz Josef just flat out refuses. He says, you can have the money, I'll give you that, but there's no way that you or your descendants can be Emperor of Austria if you accept the crown of Mexico, because partially it's because Franz Josef no longer really believes in the project, and he sort of sees that it would be a slightly absurd situation, right, to have a failed Emperor of Mexico who comes back in humiliation because that kingdom has collapsed or he's been run out by its people, and then suddenly take up the Austrian position, right? I mean, Austria should be, in Franz Josef's mind, front and center. There shouldn't be anything else. So you can see it from Franz Joseph's point of view. He certainly doesn't handle it well. Enormous pressure is brought to bear on Maximilian. Now, he goes into he suffers, from what I think we would today would call depression. And he kind of goes into paralysis about what to do. Napoleon III sends a trusted political advisor because Maximilian is on the point of going to the Mexican deputation, who, by the way, have been waiting 6 months in Europe, having first formally offered him the crown for him to accept. And the day before he's going to go to them and say, look, I'm sorry, I can't do it. He gets a telegram from Napoleon III saying, don't do anything until you speak with my political advisors. He does, the pressure from Napoleon III, the engagements he's made with the Mexican politicians and with the loan and the military alliance, and Carlotta, and also his father-in-law, Carlotta's father, Leopold, king of the Belgians, essentially say you can't back out now. I mean, it's too late. So he is forced into renouncing his claim to the Austrian throne and that of all of his descendants. It's something that he never reconciles himself to. He says he in one of the many things he's criticized for is on the actual voyage to Mexico, he spends a lot of his time in discussion with his counselors saying, I signed it under duress, we need to challenge this legally. Whereas a lot of people are saying, well, we need to focus much more on Mexico than on renouncing your rights. So he's forced to back down. And it does eventually, grudgingly really, concede his rights in Austria and accept the crown of Mexico, which must have been very far removed from how he'd first imagined being proclaimed emperor of Mexico.
Yeah, it's one of those events in the book, and it occupies many pages, and I think you devote the exact right number of pages to it. That at times it's going a minute by minute personal account, and Franz Josef comes to see Maximilian at the end personally. They argue, shout, scream at each other for hours on end. Maximilian signs the document, and then they have almost a movie tearful embrace at the train station, which of course proves to be the last time that Franz Josef sees his brother. I do think there's an interesting historical what if, maybe a piece of historical fiction wherein somehow Maximilian becomes emperor of Mexico, accedes to the throne of Austria-Hungary. World War I breaks out in 1914. The United States is involved instantaneously with a massive military front stretching across the Rio Grande. Yeah. And Maximilian is trying to orchestrate military affairs on both continents. I hope somebody can write that up.
I'd watch that. That's fantastic.
But it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Maximilian, he does go. He accepts the crown. He gets there. It's not what he was expecting until he gets to Mexico City, which is a beautiful city, by the way. People nowadays, and I hope most Americans listening would understand that, it was maybe a better city in a lot of ways than New York, Philadelphia, so on and so forth. More populous than a lot of American cities. Very well put together. An imperial capital city, if there ever was one, in the Americas. And, gets there, and I don't want to kick him around too much. Sure, Maximilian does have a lot of faults. He does seem to oftentimes simply make decisions based off of the last person who talks to him, who a lot of times happens to be Carlotta, his wife. But he does seem to try. What does he do well for the brief period that he is emperor?
You're absolutely right. It's easy to highlight the faults that he's not necessarily cut out for the job. I mean, the first thing to say, it's a really hard job. Even if it hadn't been for the fact that he's part of a foreign intervention that's overturned a legitimate constitutional government, no government in Mexico has been especially stable. Right? There's only been two peaceful transfers of power between presidents. Most presidents have fallen in Mexico as a consequence of revolt or similar instability or violence. And all Mexican governments have had trouble balancing the budget as well. He's not, this is not running the Austrian Empire with a well-established bureaucracy. You've got civil servants who carry out your decrees. So he's given a tough job. And I think one of the things that you can say is that, he throws himself into it and has a kind of, a Damascene conversion into Mexican nationalism, right? He sees himself as a Mexican nationalist. He puts Mexico first, and he sees monarchy as a way of bringing stability to Mexico where there hasn't been any. So, in that sense, he's got good intentions. He's a charismatic individual as well, and he's, when he meets people, he's able to win them over. He's tall, he's good looking, he's got striking appearance. He speaks several different languages. He's fluent in Spanish by the time that he's there. So, he's got that going for him, and he's able to win over a lot of enemies, people who have either fought against the conservatives in the Civil War. And remember, it's largely that conservative faction of Mexican politics that supports the empire. So he's able to bring liberals over. He's even able to bring over people who fought, high up against the French intervention and even against the empire when Maximilian's there. He has a charm when he meets people in person, and he's able to draw quite a lot of moderate support at an elite level into his government, and quite a lot of talent, men who have served in high positions in Mexican politics in the 1840s and 1850s. So it's not a completely foreign regime, staffed by Austrians and French soldiers and so on and so forth, and one or two sort of exiled Mexican emigres who come back. It's much more Mexican in its administration than that. So he's able to win them over with his charisma. He's liberal as well. He himself is very keen to highlight his liberal credentials, much to the annoyance of a lot of his supporters who did not invite him over to rule in a liberal fashion. He is determined to uphold a lot of the reforms that caused the Mexican Civil War in the 1850s in the first place, the reforms of Juarez, particularly church-state relations. It's Maximilian, as a sort of enlightened liberal, believes that there should be a separation between church and state. There should be freedom of worship. These sort of, good liberal policies that are fairly well established, certainly in Western Europe by this time, not necessarily so much in the Austrian Empire, has to be said. So he is a liberal, and hence he's able to bring quite a few liberals over. He's also very concerned with the indigenous population of Mexico in a way that most Mexican governments in the past, certainly since independence, hadn't been. He's the first to publish government decrees in indigenous languages. And he is determined that indigenous rights should be respected, that communal land holdings should be returned to indigenous communities where appropriate. So he does have, genuine liberal credentials, and also what we would today call a fairly progressive policy, in not just in terms of land reform for indigenous communities, but also in terms of education. He wants to have free primary education for everyone in Mexico. He wants to regulate working conditions. So this is not the stuff of your kind of reactionary autocrat, which is what you might think that someone from the Austrian Empire would try and implement when they get to Mexico. So he's got that going for him. And the other thing that, finally, that again gets ridiculed at the time, and I think to a modern reader does come across as faintly ridiculous, but the pomp and ceremony of the empire is part of projecting a public image, the majesty of monarchy. And again, he does, he's steeped in it, of course, because there's nothing more rigid and magnificent than the etiquette and rules of the Hapsburg court. But, if you're a radical Republican, you're going to sneer at this, right? Whatever he does. A lot of people buy into it. He holds public audiences every Sunday where his subjects can come and present their petitions. And, there are huge ceremonies for independence and things like this. And if some people do, buy into it. And insofar as you can measure what, how much popular support there is, when he comes to Mexico City, as you say, it's magnificent imperial capital, the center of New Spain, the Spanish territory that controls, much of up towards North America and down into Central. When he comes into Mexico City, it's, the people are out, they're cheering, the flowers are being thrown, there's these processions and so on and so forth. So he's got charisma, he's got good intentions, good liberal intentions, and he is able to project that kind of power and magnificence of monarchy to the converted, certainly. But it's not enough in the end, ultimately, because of the enormous problems that he faces as emperor.
And, we might not be able to blame him for all of that. As you mentioned, it's an almost impossible job. The French army, and he's got 3 pretty good Mexican generals who are with him to the end. One is just a, straight up old bandito, but I mean, He'll fight, that's for sure. They're moving around through 1863, 1864. They're playing the Republican whack-a-mole game throughout, Mexico, and trying to stamp out Benito Juarez and trying to get him across the border as best they can to corral him. They never quite do it. They almost do it a couple of times. And of course, the clock is ticking this whole time because, as I'm sure most of my listeners know, by late 1864, the American Civil War is all but over. The Confederates have been pushed back to Petersburg outside of the capital in Virginia. The Mississippi has fallen. Sherman has marched to the sea. It's all over except for to mop up the resistance. And so, whether or not he ever could have succeeded to this job, maybe we could have put Augustus Caesar in the same place and he wouldn't have done any better, or Bismarck for that matter. He never reforms the finances, which is the big, crack that Napoleon constantly has on him, although Napoleon saddled him with so much debt that may have never been possible either. But he does try. I like that. That's a good answer because he does make... He has expectations to make the livelihoods of everyone in Mexico better. I don't think he ever understood that conservatives were never going to become moderates and liberals never going to become moderates. Maybe he wanted to create this happy median political party that just couldn't be, and that proved his undoing as well. But at one point, I think we can say that the cause of the Mexican Empire is over. And it's just a matter of time for all the dominoes to fall. Now, I'm going to ask you to not say it was over before it began, because that'd be the easy answer, maybe. But if you could point to a time when you could conclusively say, okay, this isn't going to work, when would that be?
It's a really good question. I think, as you say, the Civil War context is crucial, absolutely crucial, because with the end of the Civil War, so April 1865, you can now get a much more forward policy from the United States of America, and that quickly accelerates. William Seward, Secretary of State, and no one in the Union was ever enamored with this idea. They made it publicly clear. Seward made it publicly clear that Washington objected strongly to the empire, would never recognize it officially. But during the Civil War, there's only so far they can go, because the gun that Napoleon III is holding to the head is that we recognize the Confederacy, or worse, France gets involved militarily, whatever it is. When the Civil War ends, that completely changes the dynamic. It means that Juarez is able to refinance, resupply across the border, which previously he wasn't able to do. There was an arms embargo during the Civil War. So by summer of 1865, the Juaristas are really on their last legs in terms of numbers, but also money and supplies. That situation changes dramatically in that summer. And although actually that summer of 1865 is when the empire is at its greatest territorial extent, I think that is the key turning point, because it means that Napoleon III is less and less keen to keep his troops in Mexico, increasing diplomatic protests from Washington. And I think here it's interesting to think, parallel, what else is going on? And French imperialism is, of course, it spans the globe. They've been in Algeria since 1830. And that's a long and bloody and brutal conquest. They keep 100,000 troops in there by the end to suppress local opposition. They're also in Indochina, so that's modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia at exactly the same time. And actually, they occupy Saigon with a very small force, about 3,000 odd troops. They've got more troops in Mexico. But the reason I bring up those parallels is the big difference between Mexico, Indochina, and Algeria, I think, from a point of view of French imperialism, is that no one is telling the French to get out of Algeria or Indochina. There's local opposition, really stiff, determined, fighting brutal colonial repression. But there isn't that external threat. Napoleon III is essentially given the choice between keeping your troops in Mexico or going to war with the United States of America. And there's, as I said earlier, there's absolutely no way that he's going to go to war against the United States of America, jeopardize his entire regime in a conflict which is entirely avoidable and is really very far removed from the interests of France. So it's going to be quite hard to justify to the people of France. Oh, sorry, why are we fighting the United States? Oh, because of an empire. Oh, yeah, doesn't work. So that Civil War context I do think is absolutely crucial. I might even take it back even earlier, though. I might even take it back to Cinco de Mayo and that battle that the Mexicans fight the Republicans against the French invading force. So it's 6,000 French troops right at the beginning of the intervention, and the battle, of course, is on May the 5th, Cinco de Mayo. Now, this, I think, had the French taken Puebla and then marched on Mexico City, and you take Mexico City in the summer of 1862, you can set up this regime much quicker. And then remember that it is a gamble. Napoleon III is not an idiot. I mean, you were talking about naivety. He knows that he has to carve out this empire and present it as a fait accompli to Washington if the Union wins the Civil War. That's not a foregone conclusion, right, when he launches this intervention. But worst case scenario, Napoleon III is thinking, well, it's going to be a long war. I can set up this empire, and by the time Washington is victorious over the Confederates, then they're going to be bankrupt. There's going to be war weariness, and so they'll just recognize a well consolidated and founded state to the south of their border. But they don't take Mexico City till the summer of 1863. Maximilian doesn't get to Mexico, as we said, until May 1864. So you've got less than a year to consolidate this state when you've got the resistance of Benito Juarez and all of the Republican generals fighting against Maximilian. So I think another turning point, if you want to go back a little bit earlier than 1865, would be May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, and that battle outside the walls of Puebla, where the French forces are much to the shock of Europe, right? Because seeing the French army and the legacy of Napoleon and the original Napoleon Bonaparte, but also the fact that the French army has defeated the Russians in the Crimean War. They go to war against Austria in 1859. They defeat Franz Josef. Napoleon III personally commands the army. It's seen as, whether it's true or not, it's seen by many as one of the greatest armies in the world. And so 6,000 French troops should be more than enough, right? That's what Napoleon III thinks. It's not, because of the heroic resistance outside the walls of Puebla. That delays the setting up of the empire by a whole year. And it's that crucial because, you've got to get all of this done with all of the problems to solve, from the finances to, creating a legitimate regime, etc., before Washington can turn its full attention to diplomatic pressure. And if that doesn't work, to military intervention. Of course, it never gets that far. So I might take it back to 1862, May 5th.
Well, that's a good point because, again, just to refresh my listeners, if you don't remember, by the summer of 1863, the Union can start to be a little bit more aggressive even in its actions, because by the summer of 1863, of course, General Grant has taken Vicksburg, which means the Union now has control of the Mississippi River. And of course, General Lee has been pushed back at Gettysburg, which is probably the highest Confederate extent of the war at that point. So things are turning in 1863. And one other thing, if you think about 1865, even though Napoleon was told that the American Civil War was going to continue, it doesn't, of course. But don't forget also, in Europe, and you point this out in the book, in the 1860s, mid to late 1860s, that's when Prussia is stitching together the German Empire for the first time. So Prussia is going to hammer the Austrians in a war that Napoleon III expects to take a long time. It doesn't. It's lightning quick. Franz Josef is beaten fairly handily. And so now all of a sudden, can you have 30,000 French troops in Mexico when you have potentially a belligerent Bismarck on the other side of the Rhine River? Suddenly this doesn't seem like the gamble is worth it. The goal was to get Mexico on the cheap and to get all those resources. Well, that's not happening. And so Napoleon does pull the plug on the whole enterprise. There's a good deal of back and forth. It's very well documented in the book. We won't get into it here. But my question is, at this point, when Napoleon pulls the plug and multiple generals and diplomats are telling Maximilian, this is over, why doesn't he just, this is where the book for me starts to turn into a very personal tragedy. Why doesn't he just abdicate the throne and go back to Europe?
I mean, it's a great question. And the short answer is that's what he decides to do twice. But each time he's talked down. The first time Napoleon III announces to the world before he announces to Maximilian that he's withdrawing his troops, that he will not send any more men or money to prop up the Mexican Empire, right? So the key ally, really the life support is, as you say, the plug is pulled. Takes a while for that to sink in to Maximilian. He thinks that Napoleon III can be taught around. But when it becomes apparent that that's not going to happen, he decides to abdicate. Now, this is one of those moments where Carlotta comes into the frame, front and center, and it goes apoplectic when Maximilian explains that he's going to renounce the empire, return to Europe in humiliation. So the important context is that she is the granddaughter of Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe was the French king who, in the face of the revolutions of 1848, in February, abdicated. And Carlotta was only 8 years old when her grandfather did that. But she saw it as a stain on the family, and she saw it as humiliating and shameful, and partially because other members of her family told her that, right? I mean, she's only an 8-year-old girl. But she's got this so she has this sort of deep kind of psychological scar about abdication. It's cowardly. It ruined her family. So she thought, who had to live out their life in exile in England. Not so bad, but I guess he's not king of France. So when she hears that Maximilian is going to abdicate, she goes, as I say, apoplectic. She harangues him, and she puts her thoughts down in an incredibly long, and actually it's even reading it today, but sort of as a vitriolic and bitter memorandum, essentially, stretching across pages, insulting Maximilian, it's really saying, you're an idiot, you're a coward, no one does this. There's a phrase in there that kings in the Middle Ages at least waited until someone took their state before they gave it up. And that if there's only 6 feet of territory, governed by an emperor, there'll still be an empire, i.e., you go down fighting, you're not going back to Europe. The flip side, the more positive side is she said, look, I will go to France. I will speak to Napoleon III. Napoleon III has made all kinds of binding promises to Maximilian that he will never desert him. He's put this in writing. He said it in person that, my support will never fail you is the exact phrase that he uses. So Carlotta says, I will go back to Europe. I will speak to Napoleon III. I will convince him of his error, and he will, restore support for the Mexican Empire. So that's the first. And as I say, she is an incredibly persuasive woman, especially in terms of speaking to Maximilian. So Maximilian says, "Fine, absolutely. You do that. I'll carry on here." Now, I mean, that's a whole saga in of itself, is Carlotta's, time in Paris, and then she goes on to try and to speak to the Pope. In Paris, she's singly unable to change Napoleon III's mind. I mean, Napoleon III's mind was made up long ago. He's not going to change it. There's some dramatic meetings. He tries to avoid meeting her, as you would, because no one likes to be reminded of promises you can't keep, right? But he claims to be sick, tries to avoid it, eventually meets with her, and just, he actually breaks down into tears when she reminds him of the promises that he's made, but says, there's nothing I can do. I can't give any more money. The French people won't accept it. The American government is putting pressure on me. And Carlotta fails. The next step, so the final weapon that she has in her arsenal, is to go to see the Pope and plead with the Pope for support, because there's huge religious divides in Mexico. And part of the reason Maximilian had been called there in the first place was because he was expected to back the church. He doesn't, because of, as we said earlier, he's got these liberal ideas. But if he can get a concordat with the Pope, much like the first Napoleon managed to, well, under duress really, but still managed to bring a lot of Catholic France on board, that could rally support for the empire as well. So she's determined to go to see the Pope. Now, this is a huge amount of pressure she's put on herself, that essentially the survival of the empire and potentially her husband's life. And the strain is too much. Her mind begins to unravel. She can't sleep. She's having feverish dreams. And this all comes to a head in the Vatican itself when she goes to see the Pope. And she has a complete mental breakdown. She believes that Napoleon III is essentially the devil incarnate and has sent people to poison her, to murder her. And they're amongst her own entourage, the people that she's traveled to Rome with. She refuses to leave the Vatican. And so a complete breakdown from which she never recovers. And she descends into madness and is unable to return to Mexico. The plan was for her to go back, a couple of months after seeing the Pope. Of course, she can't do that. So, right, as you say, it's simple for Maximilian now, right? The mission has failed. His wife's seriously ill. You abdicate and go back to Europe. And again, that's exactly what he decides to do. But this is one of the key character traits of Maximilian, is that he is indecisive, he prevaricates, and he's impressionable as well. He's very impressionable. And so in Mexico, what you have is he's now got no support whatsoever apart from the hardcore conservative politicians who invite him in the first place. So he has to do a complete volte-face when he decides to stay in the first place after Carlotta goes, in order to continue to have politicians who are willing to work with him. Their fate is completely tied to the survival of the empire. I mean, they know that if Juarez wins, they might be executed, imprisoned, exiled, and their entire political vision of a Catholic and authoritarian Mexico is defeated forever. So they have every single interest in keeping Maximilian in Mexico, and they pull out all the stops. They promise him everything. So he does abdicate. He even ships his furniture. He ships his archive off back to Austria, where it resides still in Vienna. So he's resolved to go, but as he's making his way to Veracruz, where he's going to get a ship back to Europe, he begins to see thousands of people coming out to see him as he comes into a town on the way to Veracruz, and they're cheering and they're proclaiming the monarchy and so on and so forth. He begins to waver. It's still, as I say, no decision is ever easy with Maximilian, right? It takes a lot of pressure. But all of this has been orchestrated by the Conservative Party. They still got enough support to put on a bit of a show, a bit of a pageant, get a few thousand people to shout, long live the empire. They get the best generals. We mentioned them earlier. You've got Miramon, Marquez as well, who come to see him personally and pledge their allegiance. And they say, we can raise tens of thousands of men. The politicians from Mexico City come to see him and say, we can raise, millions of dollars. And so he's gradually worked on and to the point where he says, okay, I'm not going to abdicate, but what I will do is I will call a national convention and we will have an election, and then people can decide on whether the monarchy should continue or not. The Conservatives know that that's never going to happen, right? But they accept it because it means that he's going to stay in the country. There's no way they can have an election. The empire itself is increasingly small territorially. The Liberals are not suddenly going to put down their arms, on the point of victory and say, yeah, let's vote on this. So it shows slightly his naivety and that he thinks that this is a workable solution, and it keeps him in the country. And so, he decides to go twice. Twice he's talked out of it.
Yeah, the whole episode to me just streams of you see the person, driving towards the edge of the cliff, and they're just shouting, just turn the wheel. All you have to do is turn the wheel. At one point, he takes the foot off the gas. It's just in neutral. Now he's just rolling. Just turn the wheel. And at the end, as you say, he gets fixated on the idea that we're going to have this big national assembly. We're all going to vote on this. And then I can leave with my honor and my dignity because I just followed the wishes of the people. But that's impossible. And I feel like he should have known that, but perhaps I'm wrong. And then, we won't go through what happens after. He marches with his three key generals a little bit to the north. They're ultimately surrounded by much larger Republican Juarist armies. There's a couple of attempts to break out. Those don't work. He's ultimately kind of betrayed, although I think he would have been captured at some point anyway. But he's betrayed. He falls into the hands of the Juarist Republican government. They have the sham court-martial trial, and the decision is to execute him along with, the other two main generals. One ends up in Mexico City, so he's not there right then. But they end up deciding that he's going to be executed. I find it interesting, though, that everybody and their mother in Europe, plus the United States, tries to intervene at this point to get some message to President Juarez to not execute him. But the execution ultimately does go through regardless. And so I wondered if you could answer the question, maybe you can't, why isn't all of this international pressure able to save Maximilian's life at the end?
It's a great question. And it's obviously a question that people were asking at the time, right? Because executing heads of state, not of course that they ever recognized him as head of state, but still, if you think about Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars has got all of Europe railed against him, and he's exiled twice. You think, well, maybe exiled him the first time. When he escapes, then you think that might be the time to execute him. But no, he's exiled again, right? Much more opposite example, Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy, who is put in prison, but eventually granted pardon and lives out his life in relative comfort. So why not Maximilian? Well, here the Mexican context is absolutely crucial, and you have to understand it from Juarez's point of view. Is he's not just been fighting Maximilian for 3 years; he's been involved in a civil war that the French reignite and that the empire kind of sits on top of, which goes right back to 1858, and you could go even further. And Maximilian represents two things: foreign intervention and monarchy. So the monarchist conspiracy in Mexico is an old one, and there have been various attempts to bring it in the 1840s and 1850s. But also that context of that Mexican Civil War. So Maximilian is executed alongside two other of his, Tomas Mejia, who is an indigenous general and who's fought for the conservatives for a long time, is absolutely loyal to the last. Ramon, who is the other man who he's executed with, kind of gets caught up in the empire almost, I don't want to say against his will, but he's not a diehard imperialist. But more importantly for why Maximilian is executed is they represent two other important strands of the fight that Juarez has been engaged in. So Ramon he's a Creole elite. He's a sort of establishment figure. He represents loyalty to the army and to the church and to the kind of sort of upper class, if you will, Mexican who has always supported the conservative faction. Mejia is, as I say, he's an indigenous leader, but represents a popular strand of conservatism in Mexico that is very much based around the Catholic Church and support for the Catholic Church. So you have, with the execution of Maximilian, an incredibly powerful symbolic event that essentially is Juarez saying, by executing these three people, I am ending 50 years of political instability that he sees as caused by the various things that they represent. And so for that reason, Maximilian doesn't really stand a chance, because he's caught up in a much wider and deeper Mexican political struggle that to some extent he probably never really understood. The US intervention, you think, might have more weight than the European, because quite frankly, the kings and queens of Europe appealing to Juarez is not something that he's going to be incredibly sympathetic towards. Right? He sees these European monarchs as inherently imperialist and interventionist. Getting an appeal from even the powers that stayed out of it, like Britain or Spain or whatever it might be, he's not on friendly terms with those powers whatsoever. With the US, you think there might be some Republican sympathy, right? But again, I mean, it's an alliance of convenience for Juarez very much with the United States of America. Yes, he admires the United States of America. Yes, he admires the sort of triumph of Republican government, and that's gone in there. But the U.S.-Mexican War was only 15 years or so before this, and again, as foreign appeal from the President of the United States of America to pardon Maximilian, it's another form of foreign intervention, and so it falls very much on deaf ears. He feels it's something he has to do to end conflict in Mexico, and he's not particularly, given Mexico's experience with the United States of America and Europe, enamored to listening to pleas from any of those governments about what he should or shouldn't do.
Yeah, very much. In reading the end of the book, I have to imagine that if the United States, and it would have been President Andrew Johnson at this point, if the statement from the United States would have been firmer and unequivocal, do this and you will fight the United States of America, maybe that would have had some impact on the final decision-making process. But absent something like that, I don't think you are going to see him change his mind at this point for the reasons that you point out. Maximilian involved himself in something that was way deeper than he was, and it went on for far longer. So what are some of the short-term and long-term ramifications of this bizarre affair that take place afterwards? You talk about a little bit at the end of the book, but I found them interesting.
Well, I mean, short term, probably the biggest impact is in Mexican politics. You had the triumph of Juarez, the triumph of republicanism, and that liberal version that Juarez embodies. And of course, the defeat of conservatism, these conservative factions that we discussed with the two Mexican generals that are killed along with Maximilian. You get a degree of stability in Mexican politics, although it quickly descends into more conflict and then eventually authoritarian, albeit liberal dictatorship. So that short term for Mexican politics is hopeful with the triumph of Juarez, and he does continue his presidency and get re-elected, although he then dies a year after that second election in 1872. In terms of its long-term effects, though, I think that it's really symbolic of a much wider shift in geopolitics that you see in Latin America, certainly in North Central America and the Caribbean, which is the end of serious attempts at any kind of European intervention or hegemony. It's not completely over, and actually British commercial and business interests are continued to be large as they were, and it's not really until the First World War then when that market is cut off that goes. But it announces the United States of America as the indisputed hegemonic power in the region. And you absolutely see this with the Porfiriato, which comes after Juarez. So Porfirio Diaz, who fought against the French and fought for Republican values, he sets himself up as an authoritarian dictator and rules right up until the Mexican Revolution, until 1910. So there's an irony there in that he's nominally fought for the sort of Republican democracy, but ends up as a dictator. But what happens under him is that U.S. business interests have become front and center in Mexico, and U.S. interests, sort of Washington hand in hand with Wall Street, really exploiting the Mexican economy, most famously with Standard Oil and the petroleum industry. But pretty much everything, it becomes dominated by U.S. interests, and that again, slightly ironic. Given that Diaz was a liberal but ends up as a dictator, it's the conservatives and the people who support the empire who are the great anti-Americans in this period. They're the people who are warning about the expansion of America, the development of U.S. interest, and the threat to Catholicism, all of that stuff. That then becomes obviously, right up to this day, very much the preserve of the left, and so that shift that I think this episode marks is the hegemony of the Americas. And you could say perhaps the Cuban Missile Crisis, 100 years later, with the Soviet Union, maybe that's the next time that there's a really serious concerted challenge to the Monroe Doctrine and U.S. power. But I think that's the main long-term shift is the geopolitics of the region.
Right, and you say it expressly in the book, too, that if the goal of some European powers was to curb the Monroe Doctrine as a result of this intervention, ultimately all they did was dump more fertilizer on top of it to create a more robust American attitude. Because ultimately, Napoleon is told, get out or face war with the United States, and he gets out. And that's... that's a major turning point, as you say, in terms of who's going to make power plays in North and South America. And of course, and you also say this in the book, don't forget, the Franco-Prussian War is now coming down the pipeline. That train is on its way to Napoleon's doorstep, and he just blew millions of francs and soldiers on a pointless episode on the other side of the world. I'm sure he would have liked to have had that money back and have those soldiers back when the Prussians came calling not too long in the distant future. But I'll end with the last question today. I'm just curious, why do you think this story, because it's such a good story, like, why isn't it more well known? I didn't know about it, and I find that bizarre that I didn't know about it. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, it's such a kind of operatic tale. You're absolutely right. It isn't very well known. I mean, the first thing to say is it's well known in Mexico. It's a foundational myth, and the triumph of Juarez becomes in a way that independence didn't, because the memory and the interpretation of independence was contested, less so now, but certainly in the 19th century, a foundational unifying myth. And so in Mexico, it's well known. But outside of Mexico, you're absolutely right. And it partly for the reasons we've talked about, it gets subsumed into much bigger events and conflicts, or at least bigger for the United States of America and Europe. I mean, you're absolutely right. From the US point of view, you've got the American Civil War going on, right? This titanic struggle for the very future of the Union itself. And what's going on south of the border is going to be much less important to your national story, right? But even so, in Europe as well, it's not well known at all. I mean, it was notorious at the time. And partially, again, for the reasons you mentioned, Napoleon III spending hundreds of millions of francs and tens of thousands of soldiers in Mexico when, the Prussians are sort of knitting together Germany into a militaristic state on the Rhine is seen as one in a series of miscalculations that Napoleon III makes. But it's subsumed into that with the Franco-Prussian War. That's what people remember, not an expedition to Mexico. Also, it's just part of the general black legend that develops around Napoleon III. He's sort of been vaguely rehabilitated in some historiography, but is seen as almost a joke, really, in the French Republican tradition. And therefore, the events of it's just the kind of ridiculous thing that he would do, and it was a disaster. But what do you expect if you've got a buffoon in charge of your country? It's not something that's particularly seriously interrogated. Again, until recently, where plenty of scholars now in the last 20 years or so have really kind of dug into the Mexican Empire and looked at it. But also that Mexican tradition, because again, Mexican scholars recently have looked at the Mexican roots of the empire, but in the kind of officialist history that came out of Mexico, it was very much seen as there's a few reactionary priests and some some European imperialists got together and created this this shameful regime, but good ultimately triumphed and turned it into a very simple narrative that I think that fed into other histories both in the United States and Britain, and therefore again slightly sort of stripping it away of its complexity and making it perhaps seem like a less interesting or event or worthwhile studying. So I think there's a variety of reasons, but hopefully people will find out about it now, because as you say, it is an extraordinary story, and I obviously have studied it and written about it, and still sometimes I can't believe that there was a monarchy in Mexico during the 1860s while the US Civil War was raging north of the border. It is an absolutely extraordinary event, and with some extraordinary characters that, as for the reasons I've outlined, has been kind of erased from people's consciousness. And you occasionally, often when I did a PhD in French imperialism in Latin America, with a special focus on Mexico for obvious reasons, because of the intervention in the 1860s. That when I would try and explain that sort of awkward moment when you explain what your PhD is, it's about French imperialism in Latin America, and people would just say, "Oh well, that won't take very long," because there wasn't any. So it is a story that has somehow fallen through the cracks, and occasionally you people know the Manet painting, The Execution of Maximilian, which is a fantastic depiction of the final moment and the firing squad. But other than that, as you say, it's something that is not. Given the characters involved and so on and so forth, it does seem strangely overlooked.
It's just got so many characters. That's the thing that blows my mind, that people don't talk about it more. It's got more, and we didn't even get into the myriad escape attempts that happened leading up to the execution.
Yeah.
And some of the other cast of characters that are involved here, it's a relatively short story, but it packs so much of a punch for what you get, because it's one of these books where I put it down and I'm like, I can't believe it was a little less than 300 pages in length, given how much story is just crammed into it. I mean, things are constantly happening in Mexico, back in Europe, and so on and so forth. And these things are interplaying. And so many of the decisions are being made on this crazy personal basis that I guess for me, I think, okay, well, maybe they did that in the Middle Ages. Maybe that was how things were done back then. You made promises and so on and so forth. But to think that these sorts of things were still going on in the late 19th century blows my mind a little bit. And, well, it's an excellent book. I hope that everybody picks up a copy of it. It's very well done, and I hope it does well. I certainly recommend it. And it's a story that if you haven't heard it and you take a chance on it, you won't regret it. And you'll come out of it with a deeper appreciation for certainly Mexican history, French imperial history, maybe even United States history to an extent, to understand our relationship to Mexico today. I think it's valuable in all of those ways. So I just wanted to thank you again for sitting down with me and having this conversation. It was really great.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
I want to thank Shawcross again for sitting down with me for that hour-long interview. It was amazing. And again, I cannot recommend the book enough. I'll send out further information again once it comes out. But it's available anywhere you buy your books. All the book people that I talk to, the authors, literary agents and stuff, they generally work with basic books. So if you go to basicbooks.com, you'll be able to find any of the titles of things that I go through. If you want, as I said at the beginning, a story that follows this a little bit closely, but it's not, a full audio book. It's kind of the Cliff's Notes versions, but I hit the main points. Check out my 2.5-hour-long version of The Last Emperor of Mexico, available for patrons at patreon.com/Western Civ Podcast.